policy, civil military relations, U.S. operations and strategy, deterrence and escalation, and security issues in Asia and the Persian Gulf. She's the author of an award-winning book, The Dictator's Dilemma, Battlefield Effectiveness in Authoritarian Regimes, which was published by Cornell in 2015, and has just published the 4th edition of what is really a terrific book on U.S. defense politics, The Origins of Security Policy, which is sort of co-authored with Harvey Sapolsky and Eugene Goltz, both of the program. And I think as a text that's really widely read and used throughout the country. She's currently working on a book on nuclear escalation, risks, and world politics with Brendan Green, as well as in the final stages of, I think, what she's going to talk to us today about, of a 2-year project that examines the strategic military implications of China's potential control of Taiwan. Her work has received funding from the Department of Defense, the Carnegie Corporation, the Smith-Richardson Foundation, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Stanton Foundation, among others. Previously, she worked as a researcher at CSIS, as a consultant at the Office of Net Assessment, and as a professor at Georgetown University. So please join me in welcoming Caitlin Talmadge.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for the warm welcome. It is really, really nice to be back in person at SSP, and especially presenting this research on the potential military implications of Chinese control of Taiwan, which is a project that resonates in certain ways with SSP for me, at least personally. Not only is my co-author someone who I went to grad school with here in SSP, but when Brendan and I were working up the very first draft of this paper, and it was really just kind of a 20-page smattering of ideas. The very first place we wanted to take it on the road was to MIT, to the grad students who we knew would give us a lot of ideas for improving it. And I think some of you were at that discussion. We're very grateful for the feedback that you gave us then. And we've gone on to have the benefit of advice from a number of other SSPers, Barry, Owen, Eric, Taylor, and even some SSP alums that we didn't go to grad school with, like Eugene, Goltz, Daryl Press, and so forth. And so it's just been an interesting project for me personally, kind of at different stages, having the opportunity to connect with other SSPers, and it feels very fitting to be here today presenting it. So I'm excited to do that. Unless you have, let me see, do we have connection here? Yep, there we go. Unless you've been living under a rock lately, you know that the Taiwan Strait has kind of been heating up in terms of the media attention and concern about potential conflict with China. There's been lots of attention to what's perceived to be at least an increasing Chinese threat to Taiwan, and analysis of the question of whether China will attempt to coerce or invade, take over Taiwan, what the outcome of that sort of military conflict would be, whether the US would intervene, what Taiwan's capabilities are to defend itself, and on and on and on. There's been a lot less attention to the question of what might happen after reunification, after China actually gained control of Taiwan. If that were to be the outcome of a military conflict in the Strait, what would that look like and what would the military implications be? And that's what Brendan and I decided to look at in this project. And in my talk today, I would like to walk you through our research, which is still in progress. We are getting, we hope, to the final stages, but we're not totally there yet. So we welcome feedback, but we'll try to do 3 main things, or I'll try to do 3 main things in the talk today. First is to tell you a little bit more about the research question, sharpen the question of what the strategic military implications of Chinese control of Taiwan actually are, tell you a little bit about the background of the project, the argument that we make, and the analytical approach that we take to answering that question. Second, walk you through some of the analysis that we actually do, trying to assess the military impact of Chinese control of Taiwan, and in particular, discuss the impact of key Chinese military assets that China might be able to base on Taiwan in the event of reunification. For reasons that I will get into as we go along, I'm going to focus today in particular on the impact of China basing submarines on Taiwan and what that would mean for undersea warfare. And also the impact of China potentially deploying underwater acoustic sensors off Taiwan, and what that would mean for China's ocean surveillance capability. And the net impact of this section of the talk is to try to get at the question of what Chinese control of Taiwan might mean for the US ability to operate the Philippine Sea. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And then in the third section of the talk, I want to kind of broaden out from the specific effects of control of Taiwan on, particular military balances at kind of the tactical and operational levels, to the broader question of what does that mean for US pursuit of strategic objectives if it maintains its current grand strategy post-reunification? What does that mean at the strategic level? And even more broadly, what do our findings about the potential military value of Taiwan mean for grand strategy? And so I'll broaden out from the military analysis to the broader topics. So with that, let me just delve in a bit more and sharpen the research question for you. So in this project, we're really trying to understand how would Chinese control of Taiwan affect the US-China military balance, and specifically China's ability to conduct key military missions relevant to US-China competition and conflict post-reunification. Now, an assumption here is that there would be the potential for conflict and at least continued competition post-reunification. If that assumption is false, if it's the case that post-reunification, for whatever reason, the US and China are no longer engaged in strategic competition, you can think of various reasons that might happen, or there is no future US-China conflict that could occur post-reunification, then these are military advantages in a war that will never be fought or competition that will never be had. And so, if that's the case, that's fine. But our question is, if those things do happen, how does control of Taiwan play into that picture? And intuitively, there are some reasons to think that control of Taiwan could matter for the balance of military power in East Asia. Just looking at the map, intuitively, Taiwan does sit at the center of the first island chain. It is, potentially kind of a gateway to the Philippine Sea and the Western Pacific. It also sits at the edge of the continental shelf, where water depths rapidly drop off from the hundreds of meters into the thousands of meters, which is significant for some reasons I'll talk about as we go along. But there are some reasons to think that this real estate, just as a piece of territory, potentially could have outsized importance. And that's really what we're trying to get at in this project. We are not, for example, looking at the question at other ways that reunification could affect the military balance. So just as a hypothetical, China spends a significant portion of its military budget right now preparing for Taiwan contingencies. It's possible that post-reunification, those parts of the budget could go to other things, and that would have an effect on the military balance. It's also possible that depending on how reunification happens, China could be engaged in a really costly occupation effort or be engaged in a war for reunification that destroys a lot of its military assets. And so the way reunification happens could decrease Chinese military power. And those are all possibilities. We actually set those aside, though, in this project and are really just focused on the real estate question. What's the geostrategic value of Taiwan? And this is a question that has actually been kind of ignored in the current debate. A lot of the mainstream debate over Taiwan, especially prior to recent events that have brought a little more attention to military issues, has been really over Taiwan's political importance, Chinese nationalist rather than military motives in potentially seeking reunification, and the importance of Taiwan for US alliance credibility. If any of you read Foreign Affairs, just very recently, Tsai Ing-wen, Taiwan's president, published a long essay about the value to the United States of the commitment to Taiwan. And again, that value was framed primarily in political and diplomatic terms about the importance of having a relationship with a democratic ally and US credibility and so forth, with really just kind of a passing mention of the military issues. To the extent that the military issues are assessed in thinking about the relationship with Taiwan, often they're kind of mentioned and then dismissed. So some advocates of seeking a grand bargain with China, for instance, that would include concessions on Taiwan, largely dismiss China's military value. The most famous of these is Charlie Glazer in a piece that he wrote, I think in 2015. It's been a few years, since he wrote this. But the basic idea was the U.S. Can give over Taiwan to China, cease its commitment in exchange for Chinese promises not to engage in further territorial expansion or other behaviors in the region that the United States might not like. And a premise here for that bargain to make sense is that Taiwan itself is not militarily valuable and does not change the military balance of power. So Charlie has this line in his article, available analyses provide little reason to worry that possession of Taiwan would significantly increase China's military reach or ability to project power. Although he also notes this is something that should probably be studied more. And so, we kind of take our cue from that, but I would just note that those grand bargain propositions really build on this premise that Taiwan does not have military value. Others do assert that Taiwan has military value, but not in a way that is comprehensively and systematically analyzed, and usually not from a more objective perspective. It's sometimes talked about from China's perspective that the island has military value, but again, without kind of assessing whether that's really true or not. So we're all probably familiar with the famous MacArthur saying that Taiwan is an unsinkable aircraft carrier and submarine tender, which kind of gets at this idea of Taiwan having military value. And there are studies that point in this direction, but do not actually conduct much of an analysis of what the military value of the island will be. And so that's something that we think needs to be done for a couple of reasons. One is, can we get this to, there we go. We think it actually points to a potential motive that's not often well understood for Chinese efforts at reunification. Usually these are painted as being about Chinese domestic politics and nationalist motives, and those certainly, would be in the mix. But if the island has military value, that may also itself be an impetus to seek control of the island. We think it's also relevant as an input to U.S. decision-making about whether or not to intervene on Taiwan's behalf, especially were there to be a situation in which a Taiwanese provocation actually caused a cross-strait crisis that escalated into a threat to Taiwan's independence. So, in that sort of situation, arguments about the importance of loyalty to a democratic ally and U.S. alliance credibility more broadly would probably be less important and less dispositive than just a clear-eyed assessment of is it or is it not in the U.S. interest for China to have military control of this island. And so we think that that's an input into that sort of decision-making that would be relevant. It also relates back to the question of whether those who advocate a grand bargain that would include concessions on Taiwan actually can enforce the bargain that they envision. If the transfer to China of military control, of control of the island actually itself alters the balance of power in ways that then make the future bargain unenforceable, that would be something you want to know before committing to that sort of bargain. And then, one other thing, just kind of at the grand strategic level, is if reunification happens and it turns out that has a significant effect on the balance of power and puts the United States in a more disadvantaged position, then I think it tells you something about what the continued costs of pursuit of current US grand strategy would be post reunification, and tells you something about what that set of military balances would look like and the costs of commitment in the future. And we think there's also potentially some important implications for policy and planning today. It affects how you view the stakes of Taiwan's independence, and it also affects how you might prepare if you're the U.S. military, for example, or the U.S. State Department, frankly, as we'll talk about a little bit later on, on the diplomatic side, how you plan and contingency plan for a world where this island might actually be in Beijing's control. And so for all of those reasons, we think this is worth looking at. And the main argument that we put forward in this project at the broadest level is this is not a good news story for the United States. If China gains control of Taiwan, there will be a uniformly negative effect in terms of the military balance for the United States. This is, and its allies and partners in the region. This would be a uniformly negative development, although how negative it would be depends on a lot of different variables and a number of choices that the United States and China will make in the future. And we'll try to highlight what some of those are. So the direction of change we think is pretty clear, although the degree of change is something that we think depends on quite a number of variables. The more specific version of the argument that I really want to pursue in the section of the talk I'll give in just a minute is that control of Taiwan is important because it would enable China to significantly improve its undersea warfare and open ocean surveillance capabilities in ways that would disadvantage the United States if it does continue to engage in competition and in potential conflict with China post reunification. So again, if that doesn't happen, then who cares about these changes in the military balance? But if it does, the United States is going to have some important disadvantages in these areas in ways that we think could end up being strategically consequential, and it would be a significant change from the status quo. So I'll elaborate on this a little bit more as we go along, but I just want to give you kind of one other slide here telling you our analytical approach to thinking through this problem. So as I mentioned, we're very focused on the question of, in military terms, in geostrategic terms, why does this real estate matter? And we think It matters because China would have opportunities to base military assets on Taiwan that are currently based on the mainland, and that would actually be more effective for particular reasons if they're based on the island. Now, there's lots of different types of assets that China could potentially base on Taiwan: aircraft, missiles, UAVs, all kinds of stuff. I've already mentioned submarines and underwater sensors. For a number of assets that China might base on Taiwan, the implications are relatively straightforward, right? If you're thinking about aircraft, or you're thinking about missiles or UAVs or sand batteries, all you really need to do to understand the implications is take whatever the range bubble is of those assets on the mainland and just scoot it eastward. The width of the Taiwan Strait, it's like 100 something mile difference. And so we don't do, detailed analysis on that because it's obvious that, it would be helpful, but it's not necessarily a big game changer. We think, however, in the areas, as I'll talk about in a moment, of subs and underwater sensors, that the effects are more complex and potentially more significant than just a range bubble shift. This is not just about increasing the reach of the assets, but rather that there are certain reasons that deployment of those assets on Taiwan is militarily useful in ways that basing them on the mainland is not. And so I'll go into that. But the key thing is we start by asking, what could China base on Taiwan, and which of those assets do you actually need some analysis to understand beyond kind of the eastward range bubble shift? How does the deployment of those assets on the island contribute to a potential Chinese ability to perform key military missions? And in particular, we're focused, as I mentioned a moment ago, on the question of what it means for the US ability to operate in the Philippine Sea, which we think would be important for not everything that the US and China might, not every scenario where the US and China might come into conflict or competition post-reunification, but a lot of them. If you're thinking about US defense of the SLOCs, if you're thinking about US defense of Japan and Korea, the relationship with the Philippines, it's important for US naval task forces to be able to operate in the Philippine Sea. And while they don't have uncontested access to that today, it is something that they're able to do in large swaths of the Philippine Sea. And so our point would be that an improved Chinese ability to perform those denial missions with respect to the air and the surface of the Philippine Sea could degrade US military capabilities and advantages in some important ways. And so I'm going to talk about this section next, but the big picture is that we think a decreased US ability to operate in the Philippine Sea could ultimately have some important strategic consequences with respect to other objectives the United States consistently cares about in its pursuit of its grand strategy in East Asia. These include defending allies, the mission of conventional strike, especially against the mainland, protection of the SLOCs, as I mentioned, and also potentially the nuclear balance, because as I'll talk about, China also has the potential to base SSBNs off Taiwan's East Coast, and I'll get to that in a moment. But that's the basic logic of what we're trying to do. And so what I'd like to do now is zoom in a bit on those second and third arrows. So let's talk in a little bit more depth about potential Chinese military assets that could be based on Taiwan and what that would mean for China's performance of important military missions. First, submarines and undersea warfare, and then turning to the ocean surveillance question. So we think it would be significant that China could base submarines in Taiwan's eastern deepwater ports. Currently, China obviously has a growing number of submarines of various types. If you read the Chinese military power report last week, you certainly know that. But it's important to recognize that these submarines are currently based inside the first island chain, and they're something close to being kind of trapped inside the first island chain. Not 100% of the time, but they're confined there. China's attack submarines in particular cannot easily exit the first island chain to reach US naval task forces that are operating in the Philippine Sea, where they have the ability to hold at risk targets, on the Chinese mainland and elsewhere, mainly because it's likely that the United States and its allies have strung all kinds of anti-submarine warfare barriers along the islands of the first island chain. And of course, Taiwan is likely to be pretty central to that effort. And the main idea here with these barriers is that the United States can use acoustic surveillance barriers kind of all along that first red line there to basically detect Chinese submarines if and when they tried to leave the first island chain, and therefore significantly confine the search area for US anti-submarine warfare forces that are trying to find and go after those Chinese submarines. And so it makes the ASW problem for the United States a lot easier than it would be, tracking Chinese submarines just out in the open ocean. And in particular, the first island chain is a really useful place to be trying to use these types of underwater acoustic sensors because of the water depths that I mentioned. So as I mentioned, Taiwan's on the edge of the continental shelf, which means that on the western side, the water's pretty shallow, and on the eastern side, the water gets real deep, real fast. And I'll show you another map in a minute that makes clear just how big of a change that is. But the point is, these differential water depths actually enable the United States to use two different types of ASW barriers, two different types of acoustic sensors. In the deeper waters, the United States is able to use SOSUS style barriers. So most people in this room are probably familiar with the Cold War sound surveillance system that the United States used to track Soviet submarines across very long distances in the North Atlantic. This type of barrier basically consists of deep water hydrophones that take advantage of the deep sound channel in the ocean basin and allow the United States in the past and probably today to hear adversary submarines at very, very long distances, up, including thousands of miles, and provide persistent ability to do so. It's a persistent open ocean detection capability. And the deep water on the eastern side of Taiwan, outside the first island chain, allows the United States to currently do that. And unless and until Chinese submarines get a lot more quiet, that detection method is probably going to be pretty useful. But if and when they do, luckily enough, the shallow water also provides an opportunity to establish ASW barriers that rely on a different mechanism, that rely on what's called the reliable acoustic path. These are RAP sensors. And these are different. They're conical, upward-looking, sensors that can provide only a fleeting detection of a vessel that's going over them. But when you string together thousands and thousands of them, you can actually, have a pretty good chance of catching an adversary sub as they go across you in that shallow water. So, again, if you string these along the first island chain, this is going to give you a pretty good chance of detecting the exit even of relatively quiet subs. Okay, so what's the point of all this? The point of all this, as I said at the beginning, is this sort of stuff, because of the geography and the ASW barriers, is doing a relatively good job in the status quo of hemming in Chinese subs in the first island chain. This changes potentially if China controls Taiwan. Why does this change? Because Taiwan has eastern deep water ports where China could base its submarines instead. So in essence, control of Taiwan gives China an opportunity to base its submarines outside these ASW barriers, which again, in the status quo, we have reason to believe are probably pretty effective. Now, this isn't going to happen overnight. China would have to develop these ports, and that's a conversation that we can have. We're not saying that this would happen immediately, but it does open a door that is kind of slammed in China's face right now in terms of maritime geography. And the reason it matters is that if Chinese subs can go directly into the open ocean, the Philippine Sea, it's going to be a lot more difficult for the United States to find them. It takes China's geography from the current situation, which is kind of akin to what the Soviet Union faced, where their subs basically had to get out of a choke point to even meet the U.S. forces in the North Atlantic, to a situation that's a little bit more like what the U.S. has in terms of its maritime geography, which is to say, the U.S. puts its subs in the water on either coast, and there's not a hostile landmass for thousands of miles, which makes it really hard for adversaries to know where our subs are. Now, our subs have a lot of other capabilities too. They're more quiet than China's subs and so forth. But the point is, geography matters a lot when you're trying to defeat ASW. And this is better geography than what China has right now. And it would potentially enable Chinese subs to roam much more freely in the Philippine Sea and pose a much greater, more persistent threat to U.S. surface forces operating in the Philippine Sea. We don't think this would be a big threat still to U.S. Submarine forces, which are still, really quiet, and there's not big reasons to think that this is a big ASW capability for China, but it is potentially a really good anti-surface opportunity for China, and that could matter for carrier operations, for instance, in the Philippine Sea. Another dimension of this, of course, is that China might not only base attack submarines in these eastern deep water ports, but could also base its SSBN force there. Again, this would be a change from the status quo where, if you read the Chinese military power report last week, one thing it talks about is how China may be moving to a bastion strategy for its kind of next generation of SSBNs, within the first island chain. And I think that bastion idea has some problems. It seems like not a great place to have a bastion. The waters are shallow, they're heavily trafficked. I mean, it's kind of China's least bad option. So I get why they're doing it, but this is better. This is a better place to base your SSBNs. This is deep water. This is the open ocean. This is, no enemy choke points that are nearby. So again, potentially if China were to do the other things it needs to do to make its SSBN force a robust part of its nuclear deterrent, and we can talk about those, that could be a significant change. So what's the bottom line here? The bottom line is in the status quo, we have a situation where China's subs are, for all intents and purposes, trapped inside the first island chain. There's a lot of obstacles to them even getting outside the first island chain. In a world where China controls Taiwan, China's subs are based outside those barriers and they've escaped the first island chain and they can go directly into the Philippine Sea, which is a very likely, excuse me, a very likely area in which US surface forces would be operating in, plausible scenarios for continued US-China competition and conflict. If you think about, where the US would want to be able to operate in order to reassure its remaining allies in the region, it's kind of hard to tell that story without the Philippine Sea. Okay, so that's military asset number one, submarines, where we think there would be an outsized impact. Excuse me. The second military asset that I want to talk about in a little bit more depth, as I mentioned, is underwater sensors. If China were to control Taiwan, it potentially would have the ability to deploy its own hydrophones, its own passive acoustic sensors utilizing the deep sound channel off of Taiwan, which again, that's something China doesn't have great geography for doing right now because its real estate is all located, within the first island chain where the water is shallow and you don't even have access to that deep sound channel. In a world where China controls Taiwan, it could potentially deploy those passive acoustic sensors off the East Coast. And this could be really useful, not for the purpose the US uses those hydrophones for, which is hunting adversary subs, because as I talked about, US subs are way too quiet to be heard by SOSA style hydrophones. But what's really loud and SOSA style hydrophones can hear? US surface ships. And so China could potentially use these underwater hydrophones deployed off the East coast of Taiwan to hear US surface forces at very long distances across the Philippine Sea and really across the entire Pacific. Why does that matter? Well, potentially it gives China a much improved sensor capability to find US surface forces operating in the Philippine Sea and then cue imaging satellites that can further detect, classify, identify those targets and then feed that information to China's anti-ship ballistic missiles. We hear lots of talk about China's carrier killer missiles and how they're building lots of anti-ship missiles, which is all well and good, but they have to actually know where to go. They have to have targeting information. And we think that these hydrophones potentially are a better source of targeting information to feed into that kill chain than what China has in the status quo. So in the status quo, the main way that China is detecting at long ranges US surface forces that will be operating in the Philippine Sea is using over the horizon radars that are based on the mainland. Over the horizon radar, it's fine. It's not the most reliable, but reliable enough. China can operate it pretty well. The big issue that we foresee with OTH radar is that it's not super survivable for China. What is an OTH radar? It's a giant fixed emitting target with a known location, right? These are not the types of military assets that are super survivable in a high intensity war with the United States, which by definition would be the sort of scenario where this would become relevant. China only has one or two of them. They are located relatively far inland. So, I know Eric, in the past, when we've talked with you about this work, you've raised some questions about whether they, be damaged versus destroyed. Could the United States get them and so forth? Maybe we can talk more about that in Q&A. But, our take on this is this is a target. This is a type of target that the United States in a big war probably would make expend a big effort to get rid of. And if that happens, if the OTH radars are destroyed or they're damaged to the point where they're not functional, they have to be repaired, and you have to decide how long that's going to take China to do, then China's anti-ship ballistic missiles are useless. I mean, they have to have targeting cues in order to find US naval surface forces that are operating in the vastness of the Western Pacific. Otherwise, you're just having satellites doing these random searches of extremely large areas. And so the probability that you're actually going to stumble upon the naval task force out there is relatively low compared to a world where you have that offboard cueing, either from OTH radar or, as we envision in a world where China controls Taiwan, from these underwater hydrophones, which, by the way, we think would be a lot harder for the United States to destroy. Why? Because they're underwater and they would likely be covered by lots of Chinese defensive assets, like China could base sand batteries on the island. It could also, potentially mine the areas around the hydrophones, which would make it difficult for the U.S. to come in and, cut the hydrophones, and, then it would have the protection of its own defenses while it was repairing them and so forth. And so, we think hydrophones, bottom line, are more survivable than these OTH radars. One of the things that we do in the paper, which we didn't circulate for this talk, but I'm very happy to send it to anybody who's interested, and some of you have seen drafts of it, is try to actually do some modeling on this question of, how does China's ability to target US surface forces at long distances in the Philippine Sea improve when it has hydrophone cueing versus when it does not? And it unsurprisingly increases PRC targeting opportunities quite significantly, depending on your assumptions, 3 to 8 times when you have that cueing versus when you're doing random search. So that's significant. If you're the commander of a US carrier that's trying to operate in that region, to, for example, defend the Ryukyus, which is the hypothetical scenario we look at in our modeling, that's a big difference in your survivability and your ability to operate. So what's the bottom line here? The bottom line is currently the United States has the ability to control or at least contest large swaths of the Philippine Sea. Obviously, China's capabilities are growing, but it's a recurrent finding in a lot of major studies of Chinese capabilities that they're they do not have the ability to find U.S. surface forces in the entire Philippine Sea. There are definitely swaths where the United States can conduct carrier operations the way it traditionally has. And we think that a world in which those carriers are significantly easier for China to find would make it really vulnerable to China's arsenal of anti-ship ballistic missiles in a way that it probably is not in the status quo if you assume that the United States is going to go after these OTH radars on the mainland. And so, that would be an important change. And I'll just add that this change and the changes that would result from basing submarines on the island, as well as from potentially basing other assets on the island, could work together synergistically. So, you have hydrophones that are potentially cueing your satellites. They can also be cueing your attack submarines, which are more survivable, and cueing aircraft and other assets that will be based on the island. So there's kind of a net effect here that we think could be greater than the sum of its parts. So I've tried to lay out kind of this part of the argument and this part, and I want to just turn to that last arrow and think a little bit here about what some of the broader implications are of these claims, both at the kind of strategic military level and also at the grand strategic level. So at the strategic level, why does it matter if the US, has a harder time operating in the Philippine Sea? We think, it has several implications. Some of them relate to allies. So, as China's air and surface denial envelope expands, that's obviously going to reduce China's costs of attacking or coercing US friends in the region, and it's going to increase US costs. As I mentioned, the modeling that we look at, it's a hypothetical scenario of trying to defend the Ryukyus. But, if you talk to the Japanese, that's not like a totally crazy scenario. That's something that, they worry about. And that scenario is a lot harder in a world where China controls Taiwan, which, I think is also why you hear Japan saying more about Taiwan lately. Secondly, we think that the world we're describing is one in which conventional strike on the mainland gets significantly more difficult. Now, again, do you care about this mission? I think it's been a pretty enduring concept in US military thinking for decades, and certainly more recently, just with respect to China, that the United States would like to have the ability to hold at risk targets on the Chinese mainland through conventional force. That gets harder to do in a world where you can't really operate surface vessels or maybe your aircraft in the Philippine Sea. You're basically left with the undersea domain, and that's a good area to be dominant in, but you're limited given your limited number of attack submarines. We also think that a world where China can base submarines in particular off the east coast of Taiwan is a world in which China can probably pose a greater threat to the SLOCs. We looked at this in some detail in a longer version of the paper, and I don't know if we're actually going to end up publishing that part of the analysis. Our finding was sort of like, well, how much China can threaten the SLOCs depends a lot on how quiet their submarines get and a bunch of other factors. But what really stood out to us was this is something that allies worry about a lot. Like whether it actually happens in wartime or not, and whether the US could adapt and do all the things that we need to do to convoy and get alternative routes. Like we spent so much time like, what are all the ways you can reach Japan, reach South Korea, and how far can China's submarines interfere with our convoys, which will probably never see the light of day. And you can kind of have that debate. But the point is, we think in peacetime, this is something allies are going to be worried about, right? Which to us says that regardless of what happens in wartime, this is going to make peacetime alliance management a lot more challenging because they're going to want a lot more reassurance. And you have to decide if that's the game you want to get into, as I'll talk about in just a moment, but it makes that problem harder. The last thing we'll just note, and this isn't a big focus of our research, somebody probably could pick this up and do more with it, but basing SSBNs on Taiwan, potentially gives China a much more robust sea leg in its nuclear triad. We can talk about this in Q&A. I think there's a lot of problems, as I kind of alluded to in some of my criticisms of the potential bastion strategy with China's efforts to really have a robust SSBN force in the status quo. Depending on how you assess China's nuclear capabilities today, China being able to base SSBNs in a much more survivable way off Taiwan, could have an impact on the nuclear balance, which again, how significant you think that or any of these is, depends on what you value. It also depends on your assessment of a bunch of other choices that the United States and China would both make. And I'm happy to kind of talk through what those might be for each of these. So, these are all areas in which I think Taiwan kind of opens the door. Whether China actually walks through all of them and whether you care about that kind of depends on your point of view. And that, brings me to kind of the broader grand strategic implications. So one obvious one that we think kind of jumps out from this has to do with the debate over the grand bargain. We just think that Taiwan does have military value in a way that makes it very hard to make a grand bargain with China that cedes Taiwan if you think there's any possibility in the future that China might actually use that military value to do things that break the terms of the bargain. Makes that bargain a lot harder to enforce because it puts the US in a disadvantaged military position compared to the day the bargain is signed. The second big implication that we take away from a lot of this is that if you want to stay committed to the current US grand strategy in the region, which is pretty committed to preventing China from dominating the region, it's certainly committed to preventing China dominating beyond its region, the costs of the commitment to that strategy are going to grow, because it's going to be harder for the US to do all the military things that it wants to do now and keep its military promises to its remaining allies in the region. So, the costs of, continuing to pursue the current grand strategy will rise post-reunification. And it's not just that in the actual crisis or war that, perhaps someday happens post-reunification between the US and China, that the US will have specific military deficits compared to the pre-reunification scenario. But it's also, as I said, that anticipation of that sort of world is going to make peacetime alliance politics challenging and again, costly. There's going to be more demands for allies to, for the United States to demonstrate that, it can in fact operate, that it will in fact be able to get to the theater. That's a debate you can have over whether you think that's a good idea or not. If you are committed to this grand strategy and you want to be in a position to, operate and maintain, current grand strategy in the region post-reunification, then, for one thing, it emphasizes the importance of not letting Taiwan fall to China, right? And to signaling probably more clearly than is done in the status quo, the commitment to Taiwan and the military value that the United States attaches to the island. And secondly, it probably points to the need to prepare now for paying these higher future costs that I mentioned if deterrence fails. And that's true both at kind of the military level, but also the diplomatic and political and policy levels too. So, you know, in an operational sense, if you think you're going to still be trying to operate in the Philippine Sea in a world where China's deployed hydrophones, then, you know, you probably want to start thinking about hydrophone spoofing. You probably want to be thinking about how you're going to cut those cables. And, you know, we could talk about how you might do that. So there's some operational implications, but also, you know, the broader policy implications are, if you're wanting to reassure those allies, are you ready to forward deploy more conventional forces to the region? Are you ready to consider nuclear sharing, which, you know, is not talked about in polite company, but that's the sort of world that you start getting into. If this set of changes in the military balance, you know, if our assessment of them is correct and reunification doesn't cause a change in what, you know, the U.S. is seeking in terms of its grand strategy. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions and your comments. Thank you.
Wonderful. So please raise your hands high and hold them up until I point to you. Eric Higginbotham, you've got the first question.
So thanks, Karen. That's a great presentation. I'm not even going to try to disguise this as a question, just a comment. And we talked about it a little bit before, but maybe I'll be a little more persuasive this time. So, you know, I think you framed the problem well, and there are always arguments to limiting the sort of core piece of the analysis. But even with respect to the ASW battle on both sides, I think is based within 500 kilometers and the rest are 1,000 kilometers away. All of the airborne ASW assets, you know, because you have to prosecute the data, you have to prosecute the target once you find it. But, you know, the U.S. and Japan have got all kinds of good long-range ASW assets up there, P1s and P8s. Right now, they can fly in the Philippine Sea. If you put that air bubble out from Taiwan, they can't. And obviously, China can then, you know, it's got the cover. Assuming it can neutralize the bases on Okinawa itself, it can put up a pretty robust ASW bubble itself. So if the U.S. even if the U.S. is planning on prosecuting those targets with submarines, that becomes much more difficult. You know, it becomes much more difficult to put U.S. subs right off those bases if China's got unrestricted, you know, an unrestricted capability to put up airborne ASW. And obviously, you know, subs have some advantages in prosecuting targets, but the airborne assets get there a lot faster, and that really is probably the key attribute to success in prosecuting targets.
So can I?
Yeah.
So thank you. I'm smiling because I think you just rescued a section of the paper that we deleted before this talk, which I worked on. So I'd like to see back in the paper. So can I just make sure I understand the implication? You're saying that the air bubble shift is more than a bubble shift because of ASW.
Well, it relates very closely to ASW, and it's more of a shift in a sense because the the air bubble from China bumps up against Taiwan itself. So, you know, it's a restricted, it's not even in distance, it's highly restricted. But yes, the bigger point is that that bubble does, you know, it has enormous implications for the submarine problem. I mean, right now, if you can fly those P1s and P8s from behind that barrier of the first island chain, you know, you can prosecute targets coming through the chain, you know, that are picked up by air, you know, by the sound barriers. You can also, you know, protect task forces. You can do open area searches. There are a lot of assets. The Japanese have specialized in ASW for a long time. So this is a pretty robust capability they have, but with that Chinese air bubble over Taiwan and extended from Taiwan, they can go up.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Right.
Would you like to respond?
I mean, no, I mean, I'm going to go home and like paste this section back into the paper and change it because we had, I mean, as you know, I think you've read an earlier version where we talk about China's ability to base aircraft on Taiwan. But this is a different argument about how it would intersect with the ASW. But the point is, you could do an air analysis. Like we originally had an air piece, an undersea piece, and a surveillance piece. We were taking out the air piece because we thought it just didn't, it has some impact, but like not as much, and it's a lot of words, but I will definitely be using this. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so next up, Suzanne Freeman. And please project, Suzanne, from the back of the room.
My God, this is my problem every week.
It's not your problem, it's the microphone's problem, but we have to adapt.
Sounds good. Hi, I'm Suzanne. I'm the third year in the program. My question is basically, so if China were to hold Taiwan, is it really reasonable to think that they're going to base SSBNs there? Like, or are Chinese political authorities going to be concerned potentially about other local resistance or counterintelligence threat posed by the population on Taiwan if they're resistant or resentful of Chinese control, depending on how that control comes about? Right, because you can imagine sort of problems for like maintenance schedules, deployment schedules, for example, or like the potential benefits of not having to do evacuation in the first island chain outweigh the costs of that counterintelligence or resistance threat.
Yeah, so great question, thanks. I mean, it's nice to actually see you and not just be like exchanging emails with you. You really exist. So, I mean, I think you've pointed out that there are a bunch of other variables that determine whether China walks through these, the door of opportunity that's presented by controlling this real estate. And I don't know the answer to your question. I mean, I personally, as someone who, has spent a bunch of time studying civil military relations, like obviously I think it's an important variable. And I think that has a lot to do with why China's SSBN force just in general is not as developed as it is, because it's a lot harder to control launch authority on SSBNs than it is with land-based missile forces. So, can we say, yeah, they're definitely going to do it? No, we can't. And I think you're right that like the political and military situation on Taiwan itself would have a big impact. Like, is China going to be fighting some insurgency on Taiwan? I mean, that's probably going to affect how fast these ports get built. And we, in our paper, we do try to point out some of those conditions, and we're trying not to overclaim, but at the same time, in the status quo, they don't even have the option. And so we're trying to say, well, this is an option that they don't have, but we will definitely outline this mill piece in the paper. Thank you.
Great. So I wanted to just invite everyone in the Zoom to raise their hand on the Zoom. If you'd like to jump in, we have the technology to make this happen. And I want to encourage you to be part of the discussion. So our next question goes to Phil Hahn. Phil?
Hi, Caitlin.
Hi, Phil.
So I really like the hydroponics piece, and I think it's much more important than the first piece. So my first thing is I had to wait for 20 minutes going like, okay. And then I was excited. So I like that one.
I'll tell Brendan.
Yeah. The uniformly negative, my antenna went up. I'm like, okay, is this uniformly negative to the US that the Chinese military extends itself to Taiwan? So I started coming up with scenarios. So one of the challenges I've always had with China is how do you actually target on the mainland? So does Chinese military solve that problem? If you put military forces on Taiwan, you've actually shortened the strike distance. The other thing I'm thinking of is that doesn't get brought up is risk of escalation. So how does China view Taiwan? How does the US view Taiwan in terms of the willingness to do conventional strikes and the risk of nuclear escalation? So it does seem to me, I don't discount those advantages, but it does seem like you find some disadvantage. I mean, Pearl Harbor is the closest analogy, and the US Navy fought a significant short-term disadvantage by putting its forces in the middle Pacific. So I guess I don't know. Pick a question out of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you make good points, and maybe we should soften the language there. I mean, so your point would be that it basically gives the US another set of targets that potentially is closer, and maybe gives some more rungs on the escalation ladder in a way, because the US could hold at risk targets on Taiwan that maybe it wouldn't on the mainland. So that's interesting. That's actually one of the first, I think that may be the first, potential advantage that we've heard in response to this. So we'll have to think about that. I think what we were trying to get at with that phrasing, and maybe we should adjust it, is just that we think the direction of change is pretty clear, even if that's true. I mean, I think it's probably swamped by all these other things. It's just like, this is not good for the US. That's kind of our headline finding. But then, to kind of go back to Suzanne's point, and I think Eric's point as well, it's like how not good it is really is like hard to pin down because it depends on all these other things, like both at kind of the military operational level and even like higher level political things about what China is going to do and in what time frame. But I'll definitely go back and look at that language. Maybe that's not the right way to present it. So thank you.
So I saw Julian and Nick B raise 2 fingers. Are these both 2 fingers? Okay, Julian, over to you, and then to Nick.
Okay, so I just wanted to comment real quick on the question of the nuclear balance again. 'Cause to me, it seems like, okay, yes, the balance is getting worse for the US, unequivocally, I buy that. In terms of stability, though, it doesn't seem like the worst thing, right? They get a secure deterrent, and they get their trident or their whatever, their triangle, and we have the trident.
Let's hope.
Yeah. Anyway, so they get to try that.
The trifecta.
And it also eliminates some, I would assume, of the issues that you raise in your own unintentional escalation. So in general, I don't see the nuclear balance is worse, but stability gets better. So maybe there's like a more follow-on crises possible, but you're the expert on this. So what do you think in terms of stability?
So, I mean, to me, that's a debate about stability, right? It's not really a debate about Taiwan. And in the longer version of the paper where we tried to, I guess the slides don't come back, but there was a version of this paper in which we tried to go out and actually further investigate each of these things, the Allied Defense Mission, the SLOCs, the nuclear balance. I think it doesn't matter that much. This stuff. We tried to actually like write up all of this. And our R&R was basically like, this is all like too much and also not enough. Because it makes the article really long and you also haven't answered all these questions. But what we tried to point out on the nuclear piece is exactly what you just said. Like this worsens the nuclear balance, but whether you think that's good or bad totally depends on the question you asked, right? I mean, there's a lot of people having this debate over China right now in general. Like, who cares if China builds 1,000 warheads? Because like, isn't that good for stability, right? And if you are kind of a nuclear revolutionist, then yeah, like it's good for stability. We're all in MAD. We can all go home now. Like the system will be drained of competition, like the end. But if you're concerned about the stability and stability paradox, then like it's not so great. And I think historically the stability and stability paradox has been most concerning when you're trying to do extended deterrence against an against an adversary with a favorable conventional balance of power, right? And so I think the concern, for people who worry about this problem would be that yeah, China would have a really, really secure second strike capability. And that would then enable it to like go do things like try to coerce Japan, knowing that the US can't, resort to nuclear threats to try to get, to bargain and try to get China to back down. So I think, that's where that would end up mattering. And the other piece of it that I'll just say is like, I think how significant the nuclear balance impact is also just depends on like what you think the nuclear balance is now. Like, and how much you think, like, there's so many different interpretations of like, are the US and China in a deep state of mutual vulnerability already or not? Like, there is not agreement on that question, in my opinion. So whether there's a change depends on if you agree on what the baseline is. So
Yeah, it depends if China can build a real SSBN.
yes, but they might not need real SSBNs if you think all their land-based mobiles are going to be really survivable. And
No, I mean, if you're basing them, like if you're thinking you're going to use Taiwan as a base for SSBNs, it better be a better SSBN.
oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely.
The other two finger on this, yes, Nick B? Okay, Nick B.
Yeah, hi, Kayla. So,
Nick.
I'm kind of a third year in the program. So I had a similar reaction to both Bill and Eric. So it's the two kind of quick related questions and thoughts. So first, does your paper consider the effects of Taiwan capture for the effectiveness and viability of the Bastion model, specifically, as opposed to sort of using the capture of Taiwan to facilitate a shift toward more of an open ocean control structure on the east side of the island? I sort of ask because it seems possible that the capture of Taiwan and being able to sort of deploy various types of assets, whether airborne, ASW assets, or kind of various XYD capabilities on the island, would sort of make SSPNs within the first island chain potentially more survivable, especially when in the world of the JL3 and sort of being able to hit the US with literal waters. Anyway, and then second, this is more to Phil's point, I guess, is whether your model considered potential risks of Chinese SSBNs being hit in port, being hit in port, and the sort of relative vulnerability of them being based to sort of standoff attack, being in Taiwan versus in sort of a bastion closer to the mainland.
Sure. So it's good to see you, by the way, after like 2 years. So answering your questions in reverse order. So the question about them being hit in port, that's a version of Phil's question, right? Isn't it? That like not that it's a version, but like it's the same idea, right? You're saying like if they're based closer to where the US could strike them in port. Is that what you're saying?
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, I get that. Hopefully, like if they actually had their subs up and running, they wouldn't be hanging out in port all the time. But this gets back to like, how are they actually, can they build them, and are they actually going to send them out on armed deterrent patrols? On this other question of, would they actually be more survivable? Like, would they stay with the bastion strategy? Are you asking like, would that still be more survivable than?
Basically, for like IV or the variable changes, they sort of have Taiwan and are able to change.
Yeah. Okay.
On the island. What does that mean for the bastion?
Yeah, I think the bastion strategy is still a loser. And here's why, because their control of Taiwan doesn't help them do ASW against our quiet nuclear attack submarines, right? Like they're not stringing, they can string all the, RAP sensors and SOSUS barriers they want, but those aren't going to hear, US nuclear attack submarines. And, in general, China's not making a ton of ASW investments anyway. So like that's an area where, that's like one of the areas of the China military power report that was sort of like, yeah, they're still kind of behind. And doesn't look like they're catching up very much. And what I'm getting at is US attack submarines, I think, can still get into the first island chain and sink Chinese vessels of all kinds, like including SSBNs, especially if they're bottled up in shallow water in really predictable locations. Now, it's not a great place to be operating an attack sub for the same sort of reasons, but my point is, like, I think they're way more vulnerable in Bastion, like now and in the future. I think that doesn't really change with Taiwan, because Taiwan does not give China a leg up on ASW against quiet US nuclear submarines. So I do think, like, if I were China's leaders and I solved these other problems we've talked about, the basing option of having them right next to the open ocean would, to me, seem clearly superior to the Bastion model. But I don't know, others may disagree. Eric has like I don't believe you look on his face.
So Kunal, I have you on the list. Is this your one finger or is this a two finger? You only get one question, so make it good.
Yeah. So let me try to defend the Bastion strategy here. So if the US submarines, even if the US attack submarines are able to get inside the Bastion, they'll be surrounded by a lot of Chinese assets, because there'll be a local superiority of China in that region. Chinese can shoot down any maritime patrol aircrafts very easily. The Chinese can detect US attack submarines not using passive acoustics but active sonar, which will work much better there.
Noisy though.
So yeah, I think even like after they get Taiwan, they have two options, like open sea patrol and bastions, which is always better than having one option. But bastion in itself is not so bad.
So That's a good way to put it, right? Like they have two options. Maybe the options have pros and cons, but in the status quo, they only have one option. I thought the problem with them, I didn't think that active center would be that useful there though, because it's such a noisy area.
If it is a noisy area, detecting Chinese submarines would also be difficult because the array gains is smaller because of the traffic. And the further complexity because of the Chinese local superiority would be distinguishing between SSBN and other submarines. And if you hit the other submarines, you'll lead to escalation, and all the Chinese SSBNs are still intact.
Yeah.
And the US attack submarines would have revealed their position.
US, what's the last part?
You reveal their position by attacking.
Yeah. I'll have to think about that. That's a good point. So maybe frame it as two options instead of one. Like they could still do their current approach, but then they also have, I mean, they also could do both, like depending on how much they build. You know, it's interesting from a range perspective. Well, I guess the range, I'd have to think about if the, you know, because one issue is like the JL2 is not, you know, it really can't range most of CONUS unless it's like outside the first island chain. So maybe you take your shorter, I mean, the Soviets kind of did this too with like the Yankees and the Deltas, where like some had to go out of bastion and some didn't because they, you know, they were newer and had longer ranges. So maybe you do both.
But it doesn't change the fact that the bastion is particularly inefficient, right? You have to dedicate a large number of assets to protect the bastion. It probably opens up an option in better ways than it has in the past. But it's so net inefficient.
I don't know, quantity has a quality all its own, right? Like how many are, depends on how many they build.
It's shallow, and this is one of the most actively trafficked areas in the world. Establishing and maintaining the bastion and SSBNs in this area seems wildly, compared to the Soviets, you know, they had sanctuary, you had the choke point problem,
Mhm.
but you had essentially a complete sanctuary up in the north.
Yeah, nobody was up there.
Nobody's up there, right? It's a very different problem for the Chinese. I mean, it makes me wonder whether the Chinese will ever actually have a real SSBN. I mean, I think the strategy we see now is just, you know, this is the way I would do it about China. You know, lots of fixed silos, mobiles, you know, make us just dedicate all of our assets to destroying our land base.
Yeah, that's what I think the
Well-
best argument against the nuclear balance thesis is just that like, this isn't where the main nuclear competition is.
No, and the fact that they've broken out, at least on the silo front, means that they don't have a lot of confidence in the short to medium term. And
Definitely.
right? I mean,
And they should.
all right, Jim Walsh.
This sort of follows on. First, thanks for a very clear talk and a nuanced talk. But let's set aside whether sea-based nuclear.
Project, Jim.
Oh, louder.
Loud.
Let's set aside this last discussion about whether they're actually going to get to a really functional sub-based nuclear deterrent. In your response to Julian, and I share his concerns about strategic stability, you were, and maybe I misread it, a little dismissive there, invoking the revolutionists and saying we're all going to go back to mutual assured destruction all hands. I don't really think that's what the revolutionist argument is. And it's decontextualized. Right now, we don't have mutual assured destruction. We have counterforce. We've announced to the Chinese, we're going to ring them with missiles. And so, and they used to have minimum deterrence. And everyone else is building, and now they're catching up. That sounds like strategic stability. Not, I mean, yes, there's a danger from the instability, stability paradox, but I think, you know, first things first. And strategic stability is like the main thing. But that was not my question.
So you don't have to respond to that.
Great, I won't.
But I just wanted a little middling thing. Again, I love to talk to clarity and nuance. In that early slide, you're listing the reasons why this is a good thing to look at. And I get that you're struggling with, you know the direction, but you don't know the degree. But one of the forces listed in that slide is how we should be concerned about this, which I agree with, is how the Chinese view. When do they view this as a net gain that might enter into their calculation of the Taiwan? And to list that sort of then leads to the question, well, what is actually the relative payoff? I mean, is it worth invading Taiwan to get this level of military advantage? That's not your claim. You're not saying that. But if we're going to weigh that in that list of 4, then we want some relative judgment about whether the positive benefits the POCC are, negligible, worth it, help at the margin to justify, that sort of thing. And so at some point, return for investment there, providing for Taiwan in terms of this military image should probably be specified.
May I respond?
And
Was that the question? So great points as always. So, I think in any scenario where China did actually try to pursue reunification, obviously a lot of motives would, there would be a confluence of motives. And I think, by far, I am not the best qualified, even in this room, to talk about like all of the motives. But one concern that Brendan and I had kind of at the beginning of this project is that the military value motive in the US understanding of this issue, I think, is underplayed. There are some really good books that, by people who are qualified, unlike me, to actually study these questions about Chinese thinking about the value of Taiwan. Alan Wachman wrote a really good book on this. More recently, James Holmes and Toshio Shihara have a book where they look at a lot of Chinese elites thinking about, the value of Taiwan and so forth. But when I hear the issue talked about in the US, it's not framed in those terms. And I mean, I was really struck, I'll just repeat it because it is really relevant, like this essay by Taiwan's president in Foreign Affairs. I was so surprised, like the essay had only the most glancing mention of like the military value, which you think would be an argument made to the US, but also would just inform the thinking about like, what is China doing here? Because I worry a little bit that the narrative at the broadest level is, Xi Jinping is just this nationalist who's gone nuts and he's going to invade because we can't predict him, or he's, bad guy. And, I'm sure domestic political motives and leadership traits and all that are important, but it's also like, there's just a kind of a geopolitical story here. And the more dismissive you are of that, the more likely you are, I think, to underestimate the potential for conflict to occur. So, you're right that having a specific, the more specific our answer can be, the more we can inform on that question. But I think it ultimately, it still has to be combined with other types of analysis. But yeah, good point. Thank you.
Is this your two finger?
Relates directly to my
This is
question.
your one finger. All right, this is your question.
But it is the segue, which is, hi Caitlin, I'm a third year with the program. My name's Nick. I grew up in Taiwan and also just spent 9 months there during the pandemic. And your point that this is not how Taiwanese policymakers are pitching their relevance, especially when they're involved in sort of track 1.5 dialogue, I think is very well noted and very much reflects the reality on the ground. So my question is, what I appreciated most about this article was that it highlighted geographic and technological elements that were not mentioned in analyses by Bill Woolrich or Michael Beckley and others. So the policy question is how do you think that these technologies and geographic factors that you've identified should impact the current US strategy of deterrence towards Taiwan? Should we be doing more to capitalize on these nascent things that we already have, rather than say sending harpoon block 2s to stop amphibious invasions or other sorts of things?
So when you say what we're currently doing, and then you say, harpoon block 2s, do you mean like what we're buying, or do you mean like our strategic level?
I was referring to the arms deal from last October, just sort of as an example of supposed commitments to Taiwan, but student deterrence more generally.
I think that, a lot of your view of that question depends on kind of grand strategy writ large, but I think almost everyone should be in favor of Taiwan being better able to defend itself. And I think Taiwan is making more strides in that direction, which is really good. It sounds like you're familiar with those efforts, but like, I think they're overdue and there needs to be more in terms of, like the US can't want Taiwan to be independent more than Taiwan wants to be independent. Like Taiwan, needs more defense spending, and it's not just buying stuff, it's buying the right stuff. And, there are some signs that they are, we've been talking, people in defense circles have been talking about making Taiwan into a porcupine for like however many years. And you're starting to see some, I think, more movement in that direction instead of trying to build a military that looks like a little America, which is not the appropriate defense concept. So, I think anything that pushes in that direction toward making Taiwan costly and difficult to coerce or attack or conquer is good. I will just say that I also, excuse me, I think it's not all a military question. I mean, I think, what Taiwan is, what I'm most worried about with Taiwan is not like amphibious invasion. What I worry about is coercion. And when you're talking about a coercion campaign, economic, military, some mix of tools, the political will of the target becomes really, really important. That's a key driver of the outcome, right? Like how willing are they to endure costs in order to resist? And so I think China's doing a lot of things that probably are stiffening Taiwan's back. I mean, if I were Taiwan and I were looking at what's going on in Hong Kong, I would be interested in increasing my defense spending. So I don't know if that answers your question, but like I think that's what the US should be pushing Taiwan to do. And yeah, I mean, we can buy as much, we can keep improving our own capabilities and we have to, but I think, what Taiwan itself does is really, really important.
I like to joke, although I'm not joking, that I'm old enough to remember when the Porcupine Strategy was first published.
Yes.
10, 15 years.
Yeah.
So I've got two fingers on this. I'm going to group them. I just encourage both Kelly and Ben to be brief so we can get back.
I'll take it offline because time is short.
No, I want to hear from you.
It's fine, it's fine.
Hi, Kelly.
Hi.
It's so nice to
see you on the one finger list, so.
One fingers or two fingers, they're all fingers. Okay, Ben, quick from you and your two finger.
Sure. Now I feel bad for giving my question. I'm a third-year PhD student. My question is that you talk about how if the U.S. is committed to this grand strategy, it needs to signal and fortify its commitment clearly now to increase deterrence, and that if deterrence fails, it needs to prepare actively for higher future costs. My question is the inverse of Jim's. If deterrence fails, should the United States be willing to risk war with another nuclear power in order to stop the PRC from gaining these advantages?
That's a really tough question. And kind of above my pay grade and above what we're really asking, what we're really getting at in this paper. I think it just depends so much on what the specifics of the scenario are. I mean, like obviously any US response, yeah, there's some willingness to risk war, but there's certain ways of responding that risk it a lot more, risk escalation, but there's some ways that risk it a lot more than others. So like the day that China lobs some SRBMs on Taiwan, should the United States unleash on the Chinese mainland? Like, no, that's probably not, a great idea. There's definitely people who think we should do that,
Window of opportunity.
Window of opportunity, time to go downtown. Right. But, I mean, you're shaking your head because you know that I'm serious. Like there's people who.
I know, but it's a terrible argument.
Yeah,
and there's no basis for it.
That's what I was.
I know. I'm vigorously nodding.
Okay, good.
Anger and agreement.
Yeah. So I mean, like from that perspective, if that's what you mean by risking, war, then no. But I mean, I think if if you want to continue to operate from a position of military advantage and keep pursuing your same grand strategy, then yeah, there's gonna be risk involved, and the U.S. is probably gonna accept some of that risk in order to keep Taiwan, in friendly hands. So, it does make me nervous. I mean, like this is the scenario that worries me most, just about the potential for great power war, for nuclear war. And in some ways, like I'm uncomfortable with where some of these conclusions end up, because it does imply that the question that you just asked, could really come to a US president. Like, yeah, there really is something we have to defend here. It's important not only for political reasons, but for military reasons. It's important not only to Taiwan, but to other countries we have longstanding relationships with, we're democratic allies. But it does carry some real risk. And again, like I think the China Military Power Report really highlights that there's like some nuclear risk that comes with that, because we are getting into a state of deeper mutual vulnerability where there are some risks there. So I don't have a firm answer. Sorry.
All right, so we're gonna group some questions now. First group will be Eric, Lynn Greenberg, and then Don Caverly on Zoom. So Eric, over to you, then John, and then back to you.
So my question is a lot easier than Ben's question. That's the Ben whose work we got to see earlier this week.
Oh,
yeah.
Hi.
So my question is really about the military value of Taiwan in the eyes of the Chinese, right? So part of the story that you tell here is that one of the key things that China would gain from maintaining control of Taiwan is the ability to trap U.S. naval surface combatants, right? Because these undersea sensors are better than over the horizon radars. But are there other ways that China could arguably track and identify vessels, right? So here I'm thinking specifically about overhead ELINT platforms that would allow them to geolocate vessels prosecute in the same way without actually making it.
Yeah.
Hold that
Oh,
thought.
sorry.
John, on the Zoom.
Hey, Caitlin. So I have immense respect for Caitlin. I keep on trying to get her to participate in various things at the War College. So I'm going to be very blunt and then back up what Eric was saying. I think this paper is generally wrong and in fact quite dangerous. Okay, so I think in order to make a more convincing case, you have to do what Phil said. And this idea that uniformly negative and significant military disadvantage, right? Those need to really be very carefully couched. And I don't think you can, in this paper, you identify the potential military consequences of Taiwan going to PRC, and that's great. But this sort of language is dangerous, I would say. And I just want to be very blunt about that. I think Eric and a bunch of other people have just said, I think to really nail the military implications, you have to compare what Taiwan does relative to the portfolio of existing Chinese capabilities or future Chinese capabilities. I'll just give a couple examples super quick. I have never heard anyone ever talk about hydrophones as the way that China will pursue its ASUW advantage. So I could be wrong. It's a completely original argument, but it's not something I've heard of before. So that might be a great thing that your paper contributes, but it also suggests that there's many other things, including a bunch of people on fishing boats with satellite phones that are a lot cheaper and more effective. I wasn't sure from your discussion where you suggested the American sonar arrays are located that would go away if the PRC became the owners of Taiwan. So that would be something you'd have to say. Maybe it's in the paper. And then again,
John, can you wrap up? We got three
it's
more.
the last one, absolute last one. And then again, like the others are saying, it's not just the Bastion strategy, it's the whole portfolio of nuclear capability that China has that you have to compare it to and say, the SSBNs on the East Coast have a really strong military implication. Thanks.
Oh, I thought you said, okay.
I'm going to go back to three more.
Okay, so I'll just take them in the order that they came in. So Eric, I think your question is absolutely central to assessing kind of what John's getting at, right? Which is like, what is the actual change? And, you mentioned like overhead ELAN platforms. John's talking about, guys on fishing boats with satellite phones. We have looked really hard to kind of find the coherent, credible concept of operations that provides persistent open ocean surveillance and avoids the random satellite search difficulties in a way that would make the ASBM kill chain work. And we cannot find it. There's lots of suggestions like, sensors are going to proliferate. There's going to be sensors everywhere. They're going to be on fishing boats. They're going to be on UAVs. They're going to be on UUVs. They're going to, or there's going to be so many satellites. Satellites are going to be so cheap. There's going to be 1 million microsatellites. And so you can do random search because you're going to have so many of them. And in the paper, we have a section where we try to kind of be fair to those arguments and say like, yeah, if these things happen and you can do that, then you're right. Like the impact of hydrophones as a method of persistent open ocean surveillance, that's going to be a lot less important. Maybe China wouldn't even do it, right? Which is kind of John's point. So we note that, but we just have not been able to find, and if you have read good write-ups on this, we spent a lot of time trying to talk to like technical experts who might read other journals or know, and we just can't. So yeah, it could happen, but it's really hard to pin down what that concept of operations would actually be and how you would get the persistent open ocean long range coverage of almost the entire Philippine Sea, which is what we think hydrophones could provide. So on John's other comments, I think I'll just take them kind of in reverse order. So John, it's not that US arrays I can't really see them, but it's not that US arrays go away. It's just that Chinese submarines don't have to pass over the barriers. So the detection opportunity isn't there. They're just deployed outside of where the arrays can be strung. On the question of, language, we definitely welcome formulations that are less dangerous if you have some. I think that, our research shows that it would be a negative military development, that there are significant military advantages that would accrue to Chinese control of this real estate. We, I think couch those in a careful way, but if there's, other language you would recommend we use, we're certainly, we're open to that. I'm not totally sure why it's dangerous, because, I think it's an answer to a military problem. And then what you do with that output, varies depending on what your other assumptions are. I think there's people in the restraint camp who look at this paper and say, yeah, I like this analysis because this tells me that the costs of maintaining current strategy are just really, really high, and I just don't want to do it. And they're only going to get higher. And I think there's people who, are big fans of current grand strategy, and they, it reinforces their desire to, fortify the commitment to Taiwan. But either way, I think it's a piece of analysis, and kind of what people do with it, depends on their priors and their other values. As far as the feasibility of the hydrophone concept, we know that we could hear surface ships in the Cold War using hydrophones at long distances, and we know we could hear subs, which are a lot quieter than big noisy carriers. We could identify Soviet subs by hull number using SOSUS during much of the Cold War. So there's not a good reason that we've heard to think that they can't be used against surface ships, and we've kind of run the traps with a number of other experts on this. But of course, if there are sources that say that we can't do this, we're open to that. Of course, hydrophones are not the only impact that we look at in the paper. There's also the subs piece, and there's potentially a revived air section, thanks to Eric. So yeah, but thanks for your points. We definitely appreciate it.
Paper's gonna get longer, not shorter.
I know.
Which is not what you want sometimes. So 3 folks left. I'm gonna ask each of you to ask your question, short, sharp, and sweet, and then Caitlin, you can respond to some or all that you hear, but I want to make sure you get all the comments.
Oh yeah, please, yeah.
So in order, Zach Burdett, Sam Leiter, and Wright Smith. So Zach, over to you.
Just for time reasons, I'll fill out by email. I think it'll be easier. It's a kind of elaboration on Eric's point.
Okay,
thanks.
Sam.
Yeah, this is a great talk. I'm Sam Leiter, my second year PhD student. In terms of not answering how bad it will be, I noticed in your grand strategic implications, it's largely about how this is going to be more challenging for the United States in terms of credibility to its allies, in terms of preventing China from having collective leverage over disputes in the region. But you do make a claim that it clearly crosses the threshold for the grand strategic bargain not being enforceable. And so I'm wondering why you think it is bad enough to cross that threshold to the point where the United States would not be able to enforce the grand bargain that it might make over Taiwan.
Right. Projects.
I'm somewhat related to what Sam was asking. I was wondering if you could elaborate on how this makes allies, like Japan and South Korea, more vulnerable to Chinese coercion. Is it that now China can more easily hold their economic trade at risk? Is it that it's easier to target them with ballistic missiles, base new missiles or aircraft on Taiwan that can now hit those countries more easily? What's the specific mechanism through which this makes that?
Right.
Okay, so just real quick in the time we have left, thanks a bunch. So Sam, I think you're right. The more we can specify the magnitude of the change, the more latitude we have to comment on these broader issues. And that's why, we try to do things like the modeling to say, it's not just that there's a change, but under a reasonable set of assumptions, there's a large change, right? Which makes it a little bit easier, and hopefully this comes through more in the paper than in the presentation, to actually have a punchline about the grand strategy implications. But you're right, how much we can do that depends a lot, just not on the how question, but the how much question. So I don't disagree with you there. Right, I think the big issue that concerns allies, you kind of hit on it. One is, yeah, they are concerned about economic coercion and blocking their SLOCs. But I think, in the big picture, you're talking about a world where China just pushes out US forces to a greater degree. It can stiff arm US air and surface forces at longer distances, which then, leaves it free to kind of do whatever it wants, right? Not only, economic coercion, but military coercion, military attack. And I think in peacetime, to a lot of people, that sounds kind of nutty, like would China really do stuff like that? But when you talk to people from these countries, like, yeah, these are long-term concerns that they have. They're definitely worried about a world where, China has free reign and the US can't ride to the rescue. And so, yeah, I think that's what they're concerned about. In Taiwan, Chinese control of Taiwan is not good for that problem.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Caitlin. Everyone, please join me in thanking Caitlin.
Very much. That was super useful.